In this video, I will briefly introduce you to namespaces, which are a mechanism used to organize code in C++. We're back to our sandbox, with most of the previous code removed. And the scenario we're dealing with this time is, what if we want to have two things with the same name? Obviously, we can't just define some variables, for instance, that have the exact same name. This is not going to work. So we are defining integer xyz, and we are defining another variable that's also called xyz. And when we try to compile this, it will complain that we have redefined the name. If this was just our code, we would change one of the names, but what if this piece of code is in one library that I want to use in my own code, and this comes from a totally different library, not related to the first one? Of course, the library writers cannot coordinate between themselves each and every name that gets used. So what actually happens is that all of this is put into namespaces, and I'll define a namespace of my own. I'll call it MySpace. Everything inside the brackets now belongs to that namespace. This is still a global variable, but when we refer to it, we have to use the name of the namespace as a qualifier. And I will put this in another namespace. And this one I will call outer space. Now from main, since our main is not inside any namespace, we can't just refer to either of these as xyz. Won't work, but we can refer to them with the qualifier. So MySpace xyz is a variable that exists, and so does outer space xyz. I'll put in some more variables that are not shared between the namespaces. So I'll put one called www here, and in the outer space namespace I'll put one called qqq. So what if we want to refer to stuff in the MySpace namespace often, and we don't want to write MySpace xyz, MySpace www every time? We can use a using namespace statement like so. What this means is every line of code after this in the file can treat names inside the MySpace namespace as if they were not inside the namespace. So now I can just refer to www, and this will be correctly identified as the www inside the MySpace namespace. Likewise, I can do the same for the other namespace. And now I don't have to write outer space qqq. I can also write just qqq. But there is a drawback to using too many of these using namespace statements, because if we now try to use xyz again, we have a different problem than before. So now it is ambiguous. This could mean either MySpace XYZ or outer space XYZ. So because we have chosen to import all of these names from both namespaces, with the names that exist in both, we will now have to do the same thing we did at the start and specify which one we mean. So specifically for this name, which exists in both, we have to specify which one we want. So my recommendation is to only use this using namespace statement if you are really using a lot of stuff from this namespace. If you only use things from here a couple of times in the code below, then don't bother, just manually write the namespace qualifier into each use, like so. We can also pick and choose. So if we want to avoid the conflict with XYZ, but we still want to access some things easily from the other namespace, we can do something like this. Now we are importing all the names from MySpace, but we are importing also the QQQ variable specifically from the outer space namespace. So now we are allowed to use QQQ here without a qualifier, but because every name in outer space is no longer imported here, there is no longer a conflict with it. So now XYZ means the XYZ inside MySpace. And the immediate application of this is that you can use the using namespace statement to bring in the names from the standard library. This should usually not cause any conflicts, because you shouldn't be naming things in your code with the same names as in the standard library for obvious reasons. In the assignments, a lot of the assignment code will be inside a namespace called FW, short for framework, and this namespace is where the NVIDIA Research library code is. So you will occasionally have to qualify something with FW or with std to reach what you want. Inside the same namespace, you don't have to use the qualifiers. So if I had some code here inside the MySpace namespace, let's say I have a float x, y, z, z, y, and I want to use these variables above, I don't have to specify which ones I'm talking about. So this is completely valid, since we are now inside MySpace. XYZ means the XYZ in MySpace, and so on. That's it about namespaces. See you in the next video.